The date is May 14th, 2026. Inside the Great Hall of the People in Beijing, President Donald Trump and President Xi Jinping sit down for the first bilateral session of a summit that the entire world has been watching for weeks. Everyone expected the agenda to be dominated by trade. Everyone expected the usual choreography of diplomatic theatre. What came out of that room instead was something that rewrites the entire strategic architecture of the Iran conflict in a single afternoon. It is not the 200 Boeing 737 MAX jets that China just agreed to purchase in what is arguably the most expensive diplomatic handshake in aviation history. It is not the commitment to buy 600,000 barrels of American crude oil per day, worth roughly $10 billion per month at current prices. It is not even Xi Jinping's explicit warning to Trump that Taiwan is his number one agenda item and that mishandling it could push both nations toward what Xi called clashes and even conflicts. All of those developments matter, but none of them is the sentence that changes the fundamental geometry of this conflict. The sentence that changes everything is this: both nations agreed, officially, on the record, in the same room, that Iran can never have a nuclear weapon, and that the Strait of Hormuz must be reopened for global energy. Read that sentence again with the full weight it carries. China, Iran's largest oil customer, the country purchasing approximately 1.6 million barrels of Iranian crude every single day. The country that has provided diplomatic cover at the United Nations Security Council more times than any other permanent member. The country that has been the economic lifeline sustaining the Islamic Republic through the most intense external pressure campaign of its 47-year history. That country just sat down with the United States of America and co-signed two of America's core red lines on Iran simultaneously. Not one, both. No nuclear weapon, Strait must reopen. That is not strategic ambiguity. That is not neutrality. That is not the carefully calibrated both sides positioning that China's foreign ministry language has been producing since Operation Epic Fury began on February 28th. That is Beijing explicitly aligning itself with the American position on the two issues that Ahmed Vahidi's IRGC command structure has been treating as non-negotiable, as institutional survival conditions since the ceasefire collapsed and the blockade went into effect. And Iran's response to that alignment, launched within hours of the summit's first session producing this outcome, was to initiate a 5-day military exercise. They named it Martyr Commander. One country just changed the entire diplomatic battlefield of this conflict. The other country named a military exercise after dead people. That asymmetry tells you everything you need to know about where this conflict goes next. But to understand why the Beijing summit's first session outcome is the most consequential single development since February 28th, and why it changes the IRGC's survival calculation in ways that no military action has yet achieved, you need to understand the energy mathematics that make China's position not just diplomatically significant, but economically devastating for the IRGC's war chest. And you need to understand the specific institutional logic that makes Vahidi's command structure simultaneously the most dangerous actor in the theatre and the most structurally vulnerable to the pressure that Beijing's position change introduces. Here is where things stand as of May 14th, 2026. China imports 11.6 million barrels of crude oil per day, a record high as of 2025. Iran has been supplying approximately 1.6 million of those barrels per day. Roughly 1 in every 7 barrels China burns is delivered at a deep discount because Iran has no alternative buyer capable of absorbing that volume, and no other major customer willing to accept the secondary sanctions risk that purchasing Iranian crude requires. That discount arrangement, estimated at $8 to $10 per barrel below Brent pricing, has been Iran's economic survival mechanism throughout the blockade period. It is the channel through which the IRGC has converted its trapped oil into cash. Cash that pays its soldiers. Cash that funds Hezbollah's operations. Cash that finances Hezbollah ammunition resupply. Cash that sustains its domestic suppression apparatus. cash that maintains the fiction that the regime has viable economic alternatives to accommodation with Washington. China has simultaneously been purchasing American crude, now committed at approximately 600,000 barrels per day in the summit's first session, worth close to $10 billion per month at current prices. And Xi Jinping publicly stated during that session that China opposes the militarization of the Strait of Hormuz and any Iranian attempt to charge tolls on commercial shipping transiting the waterway. Beijing is now simultaneously paying Washington more for oil while publicly opposing the specific mechanism Iran has been using to extort the global shipping industry through its toll charging scheme and its Persian Gulf Strait Authority email clearance requirement. That is not a subtle diplomatic adjustment. That is China exiting the room where it has been standing between Iran and the full consequences of American economic and military pressure. And the energy mathematics of that exit, when they fully land in the IRGC's war chest accounting, are more devastating to Iran's endurance capacity than any airstrike the American military has conducted in this conflict. Let me give you the precise numbers, because the energy mathematics are where China's leverage actually lives, and where the IRGC's vulnerability is most quantifiable and most irreversible once it fully manifests. China imports 11.6 million barrels per day. Iran supplies 1.6 million of those barrels. The discount at which Iran sells, $8 to $10 per barrel below Brent, is the discount of a supplier that has absolutely no alternative buyers at comparable volume, and no leverage to demand better pricing from the one buyer it has left. Iran cannot walk away from China. China can walk away from Iran. China's strategic petroleum reserves sit at approximately 1.4 billion barrels as of late 2025, representing roughly 4 months of total import coverage. Over a 6 to 12 month timeline, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Brazil, Russia, and the United States could collectively absorb most of the 1.6 million barrels per day that China currently sources from Iran. Saudi Arabia alone, with the East-West pipeline operating and Aramco at elevated production levels, has significant additional capacity that it has been holding back pending a normalized market environment. The UAE, with the Fujairah pipeline at full operational capacity, is already moving 1.5 million barrels per day around the strait, entirely outside Iranian interdiction range. The alternative supply architecture exists. China's strategic reserve buffer exists. What has been missing, until the Great Hall of the People on May 14, 2026, was the political will to deploy the leverage that the mathematics describe. That political will is now arriving. Not overnight, not in a single summit session, but arriving with sufficient public clarity that every financial model the IRGC has been running for its endurance calculation now requires a downward revision of the timeline it was predicting. Now let's dissect what the Martyr Commander exercise actually tells you about the IRGC's current strategic posture. Because the naming of a military exercise is itself a strategic communication, and this particular name communicates something very specific about the internal state of the organization conducting it. Military exercises are named for operational objectives when the organization conducting them is confident and focused outward on the adversary. Military exercises are named for martyred commanders when the organization conducting them is focused inward on its own institutional legitimacy and the loyalty of its own personnel. Martyr Commander does not communicate anything to the United States Navy about the IRGC's tactical doctrine, its weapons employment procedures, its command and control protocols, or its escalation thresholds. It communicates to the IRGC's own soldiers, officers, and regional commanders that the current leadership stands in the tradition of revolutionary martyrdom. That fighting in the current conditions carries the same institutional legitimacy as fighting in the Iran-Iraq war, as fighting in the proxy campaigns across Lebanon and Yemen, as every operation that produced the martyred commanders whose names decorate the IRGC's memorials. The exercise's name invokes that tradition because it is a loyalty reinforcement communication. It is the kind of institutional messaging an organization produces when its internal cohesion is under stress from the same forces that are producing its external difficulties. Economic strangulation reduces salaries. Battlefield defeats reduce morale. Internal power consolidation reduces institutional trust across the factions that are losing influence to Wahidi's centralization. All three of those stress vectors are operating simultaneously inside the IRGC right now. The Martyr Commander exercise is the command's response to all three simultaneously. It is not a military threat to the coalition. It is a loyalty performance for an organization whose internal solidarity cannot be assumed under current conditions. Now let's get into Ahmad Wahidi's power consolidation, because the specific moves he has made in the past several weeks represent a military coup that has progressed further inside the Iranian state than any public analysis of the nominal civilian government statements would suggest. Wahidi has blocked President Pezeshkian from making cabinet appointments. He has deployed loyalists to monitor Foreign Minister Araghchi's diplomatic contacts and to report any flexibility or concession that deviates from the IRGC's approved negotiating position back to the command. He has declared that under wartime conditions, all critical and sensitive positions will be managed directly by the Revolutionary Guard until further notice. The civilian president of Iran cannot appoint his own ministers, cannot conduct diplomatic negotiations without IRGC supervision, cannot speak to the nominal supreme leader without going through the military council that surrounds Mujtaba Khamenei and controls his information flow. This is the command structure that the Beijing summit's first session outcome has just placed in a strategic position that Wahidi's institutional logic cannot navigate successfully. Here is why. The IRGC survival strategy requires maintaining the war narrative. War justifies IRGC dominance of Iranian governance. War creates the conditions under which the IRGC's control of 40% of Iran's domestic economy, its telecommunications infrastructure, its port operations, its banking relationships, and its suppression apparatus is institutionally defensible. Peacetime accountability is the IRGC's existential threat, not American airstrikes. A negotiated peace that includes nuclear moratoriums, sanctions relief conditioned on nuclear compliance, and the reopening of the Strait to international commerce produces the question that the IRGC cannot answer in a post-war environment. Why does a military organization control the national economy? What justifies its existence as the de facto governing authority of the Iranian state once the threat that justifies it has been resolved? Wahidi understands this. The Martyr Commander exercise is his answer. Keep the war going. Keep the threat narrative alive. Keep the IRGC indispensable. And China just made that strategy significantly more expensive to execute by co-signing the American red lines that the strategy depends on preventing from being enforced. Now let's get into the IRGC's actual maritime doctrine in the Strait. Because understanding what the Martyr Commander exercise is likely rehearsing requires understanding the doctrine that constitutes the IRGC's last remaining operational card in the Hormuz theatre. The IRGC's maritime doctrine was never designed to win a conventional naval engagement. Its entire operational architecture was built around a different and more achievable objective. Raise the cost of transit through the strait high enough that commercial shipping refuses to enter the waterway, regardless of what the military outcome of any specific engagement would be. Fast attack boats armed with anti-ship missiles threatening tankers at close range without warning, appearing from coastal caves and island geography before radar acquisition can provide sufficient response time. Mines in the navigable channels that raise the probability of hull damage to levels that marine underwriters cannot insure at commercially viable premium rates. Shore-based NOR missiles with 100-mile range that can engage tankers before they enter the strait's narrowest 21-mile section, from positions the attacking force never needs to expose to counterattack. Shahed drone swarms that cargo companies and their insurers cannot dismiss as unlikely, given what the IRGC has already demonstrated it is willing to deploy against UAE oil infrastructure during a nominal ceasefire. That combination does not need to produce a high rate of ship destruction to be strategically effective. It needs to produce a high enough probability of engagement in the commercial risk calculation that insurance underwriters withdraw coverage from straight transits, making every commercial voyage through the waterway financially impossible, regardless of the ship captain's willingness to take the physical risk. This is the mechanism that has produced the Qatar LNG halt, the Karg Island ghost town terminals, the 230 trapped non-Iranian tankers, the 2 to 3 year elevated price horizon that Qatar's energy ministry has projected. And it is the mechanism that the American kill chain, the 53 F-16s at Prince Sultan Air Base, the B-1B training sorties over the eastern Mediterranean, the CENTCOM blockade enforcement architecture, and France's Tiger attack helicopters are all specifically positioned to defeat by making the cost per IRGC boat of executing the doctrine higher than the commercial value that doctrine's execution could plausibly generate for the regime. The French Tiger helicopter contribution deserves more detailed analysis than most coverage provides because it adds a specific layer to the coalition's defensive architecture that addresses the economics problem at its most fundamental level. France's Tiger attack helicopter carries a 30mm cannon and 20 rocket pods and was specifically tested against Iranian-type drone threats during UAE-based exercises in March 2026. The Tiger's effectiveness against heavy UAVs like the Shahed systems Iran deploys addresses the cost economics problem that the IRGC's drone swarm strategy was specifically designed to exploit. When the IRGC launches Shahed one-way attack drones against commercial shipping or Gulf infrastructure, the defensive architecture faces a cost per engagement asymmetry. The interceptor costs more than the drone being intercepted. The Phalanx close-in weapon system and standard missile interceptors on American destroyers are capable against drone threats, but consume weapons inventory at rates that favour the IRGC's attrition calculus when the drones cost $100,000 each and the interceptors cost a multiple of that. The Tiger's 30mm cannon engages the same Shahed drone at a cost per round that eliminates that asymmetry entirely. The Tiger does not consume a standard missile to engage a Shahed. It consumes cannon rounds. The cost structure removes the economic incentive from the IRGC's drone swarm attrition strategy at the specific engagement level where the strategy is most effective. France showed up late to the conflict's coalition, but the capability it brought when it arrived is precisely calibrated to the threat category that represents the IRGC's most cost-effective remaining operational option. Now let's talk about Russia's 1,560 drone attack. Because the scale of what happened on the night of May 13th going into May 14th is the single largest aerial assault of the entire Ukraine-Russia war. Ukrainian drone monitoring services recorded 168 separate Shahed-type drone tracks at a single moment during the attack's peak. Zelensky identified the timing explicitly and publicly. The assault began the same day Air Force One touched down at Beijing Capital International Airport. Putin launched his war's largest drone assault on the day that Beijing and Washington were sitting in the same room, co-signing red lines on Iran, discussing Taiwan arms sales, and committing to increased bilateral crude oil trade. The communication Putin is delivering is that Russia can produce maximum military pressure at a moment when American attention and analytical bandwidth are concentrated on Beijing. The Agni 6 ballistic missile test preparation is the development in this entire picture that is receiving the least coverage in proportion to its strategic significance. 1 year after Operation Sindoor, the 4-day India-Pakistan air war, India is preparing to test fire the Agni 6 ballistic missile. The claimed capability includes a range of 10,000 kilometers. It carries multiple independently targetable re-entry vehicles, meaning a single missile launch can simultaneously deliver nuclear warheads to multiple separate targets across a dispersed geographic area. The Agni 6 test preparation, the SMDA deployment, the Hormuz crisis, the Russia-Ukraine war's escalation, and the Beijing summit are not separate stories. They are simultaneous chapters of the same story. Let's bring all three tracks together into the complete strategic picture of what May 14th, 2026 actually represents. The financial track. China co-signing the US red line on Iranian nuclear weapons while committing to 600,000 barrels per day of American crude purchases is the most significant single movement in the financial track since the blockade began. The IRGC's war chest calculation changes the moment Chinese oil purchase reallocation from Iranian to American and Gulf supply becomes operationally real. China's 1.4 billion barrel strategic reserve provides 4 months of buffer during the transition, meaning Beijing can begin the reallocation without facing its own energy security crisis while the substitution completes. The 600,000 barrels per day committed in the summit's first session signals the direction of the substitution process in a format, a bilateral presidential agreement on the public record, that Chinese oil procurement managers cannot ignore in their operational decision-making. Combined with the $500 million per day blockade loss already compounding, with a well-shut-down threshold at Karg Island approaching as loading operations have ceased secreting hydrocarbons into the interior of the facility, with a 71-kilometre oil slick continuing to grow across the northern Persian Gulf, the financial track is running out of the runway that any previous endurance projection assumed. The military track. The Martyr Commander exercise, whatever its specific rehearsal content, is being conducted by an organization whose conventional naval capacity has been destroyed, whose underground missile cities were eliminated in the May 7th and 8th counterattack, whose Shadow Fleet Gambit failed against F-18 exhaust stack targeting, and whose Mosquito fleet of 500 to 1,000 fast attack boats represents the final military card available for straight operations. The 53 F-16s at Prince Sultan Air Base. The B-1B Lancer training sorties over the eastern Mediterranean. The airlift running in full swing. The AC-130's potential deployment against fast attack boats emerging from coastal caves. France's Tiger helicopters with 30mm cannon capability against heavy UAVs, and the Operation Sledgehammer naming discussion at the Pentagon are all positioned to answer whatever the Martyr Commander exercise produces. The diplomatic track. Beijing has co-signed 2 American red lines on Iran in the first bilateral session of the Trump-Xi summit. The 3 levers China holds: oil purchase reduction, diplomatic cover withdrawal, and potential planned convoy escort are now an active play rather than theoretical reserve. Pakistan has drawn a red line around Saudi Arabia with 13,000 troops and a nuclear arsenal. Saudi Arabia has confirmed strikes on Iraqi militias. The UAE is confirmed as the 3rd combatant through the Levan refinery strike, and the internal Iranian political equation, with Vahidi blocking the civilian diplomatic faction from making concessions, is facing the pressure from the East that Chinese economic leverage represents as a complement to the American military and economic pressure from the West and maritime South. Here is the honest assessment of where this situation stands on May 14th, 2026, and what the Beijing summit's first session outcome means for the 30 days that follow it. The IRGC needs the war to continue because peacetime accountability is its existential threat. Vahidi's institutional logic is internally consistent and rational from the perspective of an organization whose survival depends on the conflict narrative that justifies its dominance. But that logic runs directly against the interests of every other actor in the current landscape. The Iranian civilian population needs the war to end because they are the ones experiencing the food price inflation, the power blackouts, the medicine shortages, the economic destruction that the blockade's $500 million daily loss is producing. The Iranian civilian government needs the war to end because Pezeshkian's administration has been reduced to impotence by Vahidi's command structure and can only recover institutional relevance in a post-war environment where the IRGC's wartime powers are no longer constitutionally defensible. China needs the war to end because the Strait of Hormuz's disruption is threatening its energy security and is being used by the United States as a demonstration of why dependence on Iranian oil creates unacceptable strategic vulnerability. The Gulf states need the war to end because the tanker gridlock is trapping their own oil exports inside the strait. The global economy needs the war to end because Qatar has projected 2 to 3 years of elevated prices even after the strait reopens. And the Trump administration needs the war to end on terms that include nuclear dismantlement because the Beijing summit's first session has now given Washington the first genuine multilateral co-signature on that red line that has existed since the conflict began. Every major actor in the current landscape needs this war to end on terms that the IRGC's command structure will not authorize. And China just made the cost of the IRGC preventing that authorization measurably higher than it was 24 hours ago. The Martyr Commander exercise is the sound of an organization that understands what just happened in Beijing and has no answer for it except noise. The 53 F-16s at Prince Sultan are not noise. The B-1B sorties over the eastern Mediterranean are not noise. The 1.4 billion barrel Chinese strategic reserve buffer that allows Beijing to begin the Iranian oil substitution process without energy security risk to itself is not noise. And the $500 million daily loss that is compounding while Iran runs an exercise named after its dead is not noise. History does not record the names of the exercises. It records the outcomes of the decisions that produce them. Martyr Commander is a name. What comes next is the outcome. And the Beijing summit's first session has just changed the balance of forces that determine what that outcome is.